They say England is built upon quiet certainties. The church bell marking the hour, rain sliding down window panes, a kettle singing faithfully in the kitchen. Yet, beneath the calm of stone cottages and Sunday hymns, some lives are not as they appear. For half a century, I carried a silence heavier than stone, and it is not easy to admit, but I must. The cruelty I endured did not come from a stranger. It came from my own son. The words look simple on the page, but they have cost me decades to speak. For years, I swallowed them down with every mouthful of tea, folded them into the laundry, pressed them beneath the hymns I sang in church. Outwardly, I was the same as any other woman in our small Yorkshire town, respectable, modest, the sort who remembered birthdays and smiled at neighbors in the market square. But beneath the smile, a secret festered. People imagine that betrayal strikes like lightning, sudden, blinding, impossible to miss. Mine did not. It crept in quietly, disguised as duty, wrapped in the language of care. I only want what's best for you. That phrase became a chain, each link forged by a hand I had once trusted, a voice I had once cherished. The paradox of it haunts me still, that love and harm can wear the same face, that the child you once rocked to sleep can become the architect of your despair. To speak it aloud feels like breaking a sacred law, like tearing at the fabric of all we are told a family should be. Yet truth, once buried too long, presses upward like roots cracking through stone. For 50 years I kept silent, telling myself it was for the best. But silence, I have learned, is not peace. It is only another form of prison. And so, at last, I will tell it. But that wasn't the whole truth. My name is Margaret Whitfield. I am 74 years old, and I have lived most of my life in a stone cottage on the edge of a Yorkshire market town. To anyone passing by, I am ordinary, so ordinary, in fact, that people rarely look twice. They see a woman carrying her shopping bag home from the grocer's, or waiting patiently at the bus stop in the drizzle, humming an old hymn beneath her breath. Neighbors would tell you I was kind, dependable. I made jams from the raspberries in my allotment, tied them with little cloth covers, and brought them to the church fete each summer. I remembered birthdays with handwritten cards. I minded cats while their owners went on holiday. I sang alto in the parish choir. In every outward way, I was the picture of small-town respectability. But what they saw was not the whole of me. Behind the lace curtains, beneath the smell of lavender polish and coal smoke, there was another life I never dared show. It was a life defined not by the ordinary rituals of English living, but by something darker, the betrayal of the very person I had once trusted most. I kept my silence for decades, convincing myself it was for the best. Better to endure quietly than to make a fuss, as we so often say. Better to smile and nod than to risk the neighbors' whispers. Yet the longer I stayed quiet, the heavier the truth became, until it pressed against me like a shadow at every hour of the day. And so, on this rainy evening, as the church bell tolls in the distance and the kettle hums its familiar tune, I make a promise. I will no longer hide behind silence. I will tell the story I once folded away like a letter I dared not post. What happened next changed every quiet corner of my life. When I think back to the life I lived before the silence took hold, what I see most clearly are the rhythms of ordinary England. Life was measured not in great upheavals, but in small certainties, each day stitched together with threads of familiarity. On Tuesdays, The market square bustled with life. The cobblestones gleamed with drizzle as traders arranged their stalls. Apples piled high, their skins shining wet. Fish laid neatly on beds of ice. Bolts of cloth bright against the grayness of the sky. The air was thick with scents, fresh bread from the bakery, damp wool from coats hung close together, coal smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. Afternoons always carried the comfort of tea. It didn't matter if the world outside was blustery with wind or softened by mist. The kettle sang, the steam rose, and the china cups clinked gently against their saucers. There was a reassurance in it, as if the very act of pouring tea could steady the heart. Sundays belonged to the church. The bells called us across the fields, their sound weaving through the drizzle, summoning us into the cool embrace of stone walls and wooden pews polished by generations. The hymns rose, voices joined together, imperfect yet strong. Afterwards, we gathered in the churchyard, speaking of the weather, the garden, the price of potatoes, small talk perhaps, but woven with a sense of belonging. Evenings were quiet, a fire crackling in the grate, the steady tick of the mantel clock, the faint creak of floorboards settling in the night. I would sit with my knitting, a cardigan drying on the line beside me, its scent of damp wool filling the room. Beyond the window, rain tapped gently against the glass, a rhythm as familiar as breath. It was a simple existence, one that felt as though it might go on forever, safe, steady, unshaken by storms. Back then, everything seemed safe. I was born into a house that smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread. My father worked as a railway clerk, a man of neat habits and polished shoes, who measured his words with the same care he measured timetables. My mother kept the home running with a kind of quiet grace. She baked bread on Thursdays, scrubbed the stone floor until it gleamed, and filled the window ledge with pots of geraniums that glowed red even against the gray skies of Yorkshire. Our home was small, but it never felt poor. At the supper table, we always had enough simple meals of stews and bread, sometimes a treat of gooseberries from the garden. Winter evenings were spent huddled by the fire, my father reading aloud from the newspaper, while my mother knitted by the glow of the coals. I remember the tick of the mantel clock, the warmth of woolen blankets, and the sense that the world outside could not touch us. When I was a child, I thought life would always be that steady. My mother's tenderness was my anchor. She tucked me into bed each night with the same words, "Sleep well, my girl. Tomorrow will be kinder still." My father's love showed itself in quiet ways, a new pair of shoes set by the bed, or a proud smile when I came home from school with a certificate. But even in that safe cocoon, there were moments that, looking back, do not quite fit. A neighbor whose gaze lingered too long, a family friend whose jokes carried an edge I could not name, only since. At the time, I brushed it aside. Children accept the world as it is given to them, and I accepted mine as good and whole. I see now that those moments were the first whispers of something darker, a draft slipping under the door unnoticed until it chills the entire room. I didn't know it then, but the storm had already found its way inside. It is a strange cruelty to find harm where you expect comfort. For me, that harm came not from a stranger at the door, but from the very child I had once cradled in my arms. My son was all I had left after my husband passed. I poured myself into raising him, believing my sacrifices would be returned in kindness. And for many years, it seemed they were. He was dutiful enough, polite enough. When I grew older and my health began to falter, he stepped in as the one who looked after me. To outsiders, it must have seemed admirable, a son caring for his mother. In truth, it was the beginning of my undoing. At first, his concern appeared genuine. He would tell me not to go out in the rain, not to exert myself too much, not to worry about managing the house. His words were always cloaked in care. "It's for your own good, Mum. Let me handle it." But soon, those words began to press against me like a weight. He questioned how I spent my money, insisted I show him every letter that came through the post. He suggested certain friends were taking advantage and discouraged me from seeing them. Bit by bit, my independence slipped away, though at the time I told myself it was nothing more than protection. Neighbors praised him. "You're lucky, Margaret," they said. "Not every son would take such good care of his mother." I smiled, nodded, and swallowed my unease. After all, wasn't this what devotion was meant to look like? And yet, there were moments that unsettled me. A tone too sharp, a hand that gripped my arm just a fraction too tightly, a look in his eyes that made me feel less like a mother and more like a possession. Still, I said nothing. I told myself it was worry, that he meant well, that it was just my imagination. I told myself it was nothing. It happened on a night much like any other, with the rain tapping softly against the windows and the house carrying that familiar hush of evening. I had been in the kitchen rinsing the teacups when he came in behind me. At first it was nothing unusual, a comment about the weather, a remark about how I ought to rest more, but then the air shifted so subtly I almost doubted it had happened at all. His hand lingered on my shoulder, his voice dropped into a tone that felt less like care and more like command. The moment lasted only seconds, but it left a mark. My body tensed, my heart raced, and I felt a strange dislocation, as though I was both present and far away at once. I wanted to pull back, to step away, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I forced a smile, made some excuse about needing to check the fire, and slipped into the sitting room. That night, I lay in bed replaying it over and over. Had I misunderstood? Was it simply a gesture of concern, a son showing affection clumsily? The alternative, that something darker was stirring, was too terrible to face. I tried to brush it aside in the days that followed. I busied myself with small tasks, folded laundry, baked bread, anything to restore the illusion of normality. But each time he entered the room, I felt my body tense before my mind even caught up. My hands trembled at the simplest things, the clink of china, the strike of a match for the fire. I did not speak of it to anyone. To accuse my own son would have sounded monstrous. Who would have believed me? Who would not have thought me confused or unwell or cruel to tarnish his reputation? And so I smothered the thought, burying it beneath silence. But in truth, I knew. Something had shifted, and there was no undoing it. And that was when the silence began. Silence is rarely chosen in a single moment. It seeps in slowly, like damp through an old stone wall, until you hardly notice how much space it has claimed. In those early days, I told myself it was nothing, that perhaps I had misunderstood, that fatigue had clouded my mind. After all, what mother imagines ill of her own son? To question him felt unnatural, even unholy. He was the child I had carried, the boy I had sacrificed for, the man others praised as dutiful. Was it not my role to defend him, even from my own doubts? There was also the voice of my upbringing, the refrain I had heard 1,000 times over. Don't make a fuss. In our part of England, it was almost a law. We were taught to endure quietly, to smooth over discomfort with a polite smile and a cup of tea. Better to keep the peace than to risk setting tongues wagging, and the neighbors' tongues would surely have wagged. In a town where every curtain twitched and every raised voice traveled, what would people have thought if I had spoken aloud the truth I feared? The shame would not have landed on him, it would have landed on me. So I folded the truth away, telling myself it was for the best, that I was protecting him, protecting myself, protecting the fragile image of our family. In reality, I was protecting nothing but the silence itself. I convinced myself that loyalty was strength, that a mother's duty was to bear what she must in order to shield her child, however grown he was. But deep down, I knew the truth. Loyalty had become a chain, and I was its prisoner. Night after night, I rehearsed words I never spoke. I imagined telling the vicar, confiding in the GP, even whispering it to a neighbor over the hedge. But each time, the fear returned, stronger than my courage. And so the silence thickened, pressing against my chest, until it felt as natural as breathing. I folded the truth away like a letter I dared not send. Control does not arrive all at once. It begins gently, disguised as care, until one day you look around and realize your life is no longer your own. My son started with small things. He would remind me when to take my tablets, when to rest, when to eat. At first, I was grateful. It seemed like kindness, the sort of devotion neighbors admired. "You're lucky, Margaret," they would say. Not every son would look after his mother so well. I smiled politely, swallowing the unease that rose in me. Soon he managed the money. "It's safer if I handle it," he said, and I handed over my purse without protest. He began checking the post each morning before I saw it, deciding which letters were important and which I needn't worry about. He even dictated when I should leave the house, which shops I should visit, which friends I ought to avoid. I remember one Sunday when the bells of St. Mary's rang across the rooftops, calling the congregation to worship. I longed to join them, to take my place in the pew where I had sung hymns for years. But he shook his head. "You're too frail, Mum. Best to stay in." So I sat by the window, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, watching the villagers walk past in their best coats. The bell tolled, and I felt as though it was tolling for me. Little by little I stopped resisting. It was easier, I told myself, to nod along than to invite his anger. Each concession seemed small on its own, but together they became a cage. The walls of my life shrank until they were no larger than the rooms of my own house. There was no dramatic moment of surrender, no single day when freedom ended, only a slow drip of control, drop by drop, until I was soaked through with it. It was easier to say nothing. It began with the choir. For years, Wednesday evenings had been my solace, the gathering in the cold stone church, the swell of voices rising in harmony, breath clouding in the chill air as we sang hymns older than the pews themselves. But one evening, when I mentioned rehearsal, my son frowned. "You're too tired, Mum. Best not to overdo it." The words seemed reasonable enough, so I stayed home. The next week, the excuse was money for the bus fare. Then it was the danger of walking home after dark. Soon, I stopped mentioning choir at all. After a while, no one asked why I was absent. My seat, third row from the front, remained empty, week after week. The charity circle at the parish hall followed. I used to look forward to those afternoons packing parcels, knitting blankets, sharing tea and laughter with women I had known since girlhood. But each time I prepared to go, there was a reason I should stay. The roads too icy, my health too fragile. "They'll manage without you," he said. And so they did. Neighbors stopped by less often. At first, I declined their invitations with polite excuses. "I'm a little tired today," or perhaps next week. Soon, the invitations stopped altogether. The garden gate no longer swung open with friendly knocks. The cottage grew still, save for the sound of rain on the windows. Isolation crept in so quietly that I almost believed it was my own choice. Wasn't it easier to stay indoors, where no questions were asked? Wasn't it simpler to avoid the curious eyes of neighbors, the chance they might notice the unease written across my face? But the truth was plain. My world, once stitched together with voices and fellowship, had come undone. And as I passed the church on Sunday mornings, hearing the hymns swell from within, I would glance at the third row and see the empty space where I had once belonged. People stopped asking where I'd been. The body has its own way of speaking when the mouth remains closed. Mine began to falter under the weight of silence. Nights stretched long and restless. I would lie awake, watching the faint glow of the street lamp filter through the curtains, listening to the old clock mark every hour with its weary tick. When sleep finally came, it was shallow, broken by dreams that left me more exhausted than before. By morning, I rose with hands that trembled as I poured the tea, the china rattling against the saucer. Food no longer comforted me. The bread sat heavy in my stomach. Milk turned sour on my tongue. There was a constant knot beneath my ribs, a twisting ache that no amount of peppermint tea could soothe. My chest fluttered unexpectedly, leaving me short of breath, even climbing the cottage stairs. Neighbors noticed, of course. "You're looking pale, Margaret," they would say kindly. I smiled, adjusted my scarf, and answered with the old refrain, "Just tired, that's all." It was easier than trying to explain a weariness rooted deeper than bone. At last, I went to see the GP. The surgery smelled of disinfectant and damp coats, the air humming with the low murmur of patients waiting their turn. Dr. Harris listened carefully as I described sleepless nights and an unsettled stomach, though I could not bring myself to mention the true cause. He nodded, scribbled a prescription, and handed me a packet of tablets with a look that lingered longer than usual. At home, I placed the medicine on my bedside table beside my well-thumbed Bible. Two forms of comfort, one modern, one ancient, yet neither able to ease the storm within. Each night I swallowed the pills, then ran my fingers over familiar verses, hoping for rest. The tablets dulled the edges, but they did not cure the hollow in my chest, nor the dread that lingered at every footstep in the hall, and still I said nothing. The GP looked at me longer than usual. There were times when the silence swelled so heavily inside me that I felt certain it would burst. Words rose to my lips, trembling like birds desperate to escape their cage, but each time I swallowed them back down. One afternoon, Mrs. Green from next door knocked at the gate, holding out a loaf of bread still warm from her oven. She studied me for a moment, her eyes soft with concern. "Are you quite all right, dear?" she asked. My throat tightened. The truth surged upward, ready to spill. I imagined telling her everything right there in the doorway, the relief of unburdening. But then I thought of the whispers that would ripple down the street, the looks in church, the shame that would cling to me. I forced a smile and said, "Just a little tired, that's all." Another time, the vicar paused after evensong, resting his hand lightly on my arm. "If you ever need to talk," he began. The church bells tolled just then, filling the silence, and the moment slipped away. I murmured thanks and hurried home, clutching my hymn book like a shield. At night, and when the cottage was still, I tried to give my fear a shape. I wrote a letter once describing every detail in careful, trembling script. I folded it, sealed the envelope, even addressed it. But when the time came to post it, my courage faltered. I hid it in the drawer beneath old scarves, where it lay like an accusation each time I reached inside. Another evening, I sat by the telephone with a scrap of paper on which I had written a helpline number. I dialed the first few digits, my finger hovering over the next. I imagined a calm voice on the other end, patient and kind, asking me to tell my story. But fear rose sharper. The fear of not being believed, of being dismissed as fanciful, of opening a door I could never close. I set the receiver down. I almost dialed. Almost. The night it happened. The wind rattled the eaves, and the rain came in sheets against the window. I had settled by the fire with a shawl around my shoulders, the flames flickering weakly, when I heard the sound. A letter sliding through the front door and landing with a dull thud on the mat. At first, I thought nothing of it. Letters arrived, everyday bills, circulars, the odd postcard. But when I picked it up, I felt the weight of it, heavier than it should have been. My name was scrawled across the envelope in his hand, my son's hand. I sat for a long while before opening it. The storm outside grew louder, the house creaked beneath the wind, and still the letter lay unopened on my lap, its presence filling the room. At last, I tore the seal and unfolded the pages. What I read chilled me more than the storm ever could. Lines of control written in ink, demands framed as duties, reminders of the silence I was expected to keep, promises that were nothing but threats in disguise, every word pressed down harder, as though he were tightening the chain with each stroke of the pen. My hands shook. For a moment, I thought I might tear the paper to pieces, throw it into the fire, watch it curl into ash. But instead, I folded it carefully, precisely, as though neatness might contain its menace. I placed it back in the envelope, my breath shallow, my heart pounding like the storm against the walls. I looked around my small sitting room, the faded curtains, the mantel clock ticking stubbornly, the teacup gone cold on the table, and felt an overwhelming certainty rise within me. I could not bear it any longer. The storm raged on, shaking the house to its bones. And in the hollow of that night, with the letter heavy in my hands, I whispered the truth I had never dared speak aloud. I cannot live like this. And then a letter arrived. It was on an afternoon thick with drizzle, the kind that seeps into your coat and leaves the pavement shining slick. I had gone once again to the surgery at the end of the high street. My hands would not stop trembling, my chest fluttered with each step, and sleep had all but abandoned me. The waiting room was nearly empty, just the hum of the radiator and the scent of damp wool from rain-soaked coats. When my name was called, I stepped into Dr. Harris's office. The familiar room lined with shelves of medical books, its warmth almost oppressive. He went through the usual motions: blood pressure, pulse, a few questions about my diet. I gave the same half answers I always did, words carefully chosen, as if trimming away the truth might keep it from spilling out. He made notes, nodded, and for a moment I thought the appointment would end as it always did. But then he set down his pen, leaned forward slightly, and looked at me, not the cursory glance of a doctor ticking through patients, but a gaze that held steady, searching. "You've been coming in quite often," he said gently, "and I can't help noticing you don't seem at ease." He paused, then lowered his voice. "Margaret, are you safe?" The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every part of me. My mouth opened, then closed. My hands twisted in my lap. 100 replies crowded my throat. "Yes, of course. Don't be silly. I'm just tired." But none of them reached my lips. I lowered my eyes, unable to meet his. Silence stretched between us, heavy, unbearable. And yet in that silence there was something different, an opening, a fragile thread of light in the dark. I did not answer him that day, not fully, but the question lodged itself inside me, echoing louder than all the years of my own denial. No one had ever asked me that before. After Dr. Harris asked me that question, I carried it home like a stone in my pocket, small, unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. "Are you safe?" The words followed me into every corner of the cottage, from the kitchen, where the kettle whistled, to the bedroom, where the shadows lingered long after midnight. I argued with myself in endless circles. If I spoke, what would happen? Would people believe me, or would they dismiss it as an old woman's confusion? Would the neighbors whisper? Would the church pews feel colder beneath their curious stares? Worse still, what would my son do if he discovered I had spoken? And yet, to remain silent was its own torment. Each day seemed heavier than the one before, as though the very air resisted my breathing. I caught sight of myself in the mirror, once hollow eyes, stooped shoulders, a stranger wearing my face. Silence had not protected me. It had hollowed me out. One evening, I sat at my writing desk, with pen in hand. This time, the words came more easily, spilling onto the page in shaky but certain lines. I wrote of the fear, the control, the long nights of dread. My tears blurred the ink, but I kept going until my hand ached. When at last I set the pen down, I felt a strange lightness, as though part of the burden had shifted. Still, when I read it back, doubt returned sharp as ever. Who would understand? Who would not recoil? I folded the letter and tucked it away in the drawer as I had before. Yet something was different this time. The words had been written, the silence breached, even if only on paper, and the question kept echoing, "Are you safe?" I knew then what the answer was, and I knew I could not remain silent forever. That night, for the first time, I whispered into the dark, "No." The moment itself came without ceremony, no thunderclap, no audience, only the steady tick of the mantel clock and the faint hiss of rain against the glass. Yet something within me had shifted, and I knew I could not retreat into silence again. He spoke as he always did, his tone calm but edged with authority, instructing me on what I should and should not do. The same refrain, dressed as care. "It's for your own good." But that night, the words struck differently. They no longer sounded like protection. They sounded like chains. I looked up at him, my hands trembling in my lap, my heart hammering as though it wanted to break free of my chest. For years, I had bowed my head, smoothed things over, swallowed every protest, but not this time. "No," I said, just that one word, but it rang in the room louder than any hymn. He frowned, as though he hadn't heard me correctly. He repeated himself, firmer now, sharper, his voice filling the small cottage like a storm about to break. Still, I held his gaze. My voice shook, but the words came anyway, rising stronger than I thought possible. You have taken too much from me. You will take no more. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. The fire crackled faintly, the clock chimed the quarter hour, and the rain streaked down the window panes as though marking the moment. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, but the spell had been broken. He shouted, of course. He blustered, demanded, threatened. But no matter the volume, the silence was no longer his to command. For the first time in decades, I felt the ground beneath my feet solid, steady, mine. I had spoken, and there was no taking it back. Justice did not come with noise or triumph. It arrived quietly, in the measured steps of officials, in the rustle of paperwork stamped with authority, in the solemn nods of those whose duty it was to listen. When the police first came to my door, their presence seemed unreal. 2 officers stood in the drizzle, their uniforms damp, their voices gentle. They asked questions I had never imagined answering aloud, and for the first time I did. Haltingly at first, stumbling over words I had buried for years, then more steadily as the truth began to find its shape. What followed was not easy. Statements taken in rooms that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, forms signed and re-signed, the weary waiting of corridors where time seemed to drag. There were nights when I wondered if I had made a mistake, when fear whispered that by speaking out I had unleashed something I could not contain. But then came the day of reckoning. The courtroom was colder than I expected, its high windows letting in pale winter light. The benches were worn smooth by generations, the air thick with the weight of stories heard before mine. I sat, hands clasped, voice trembling as I gave my account. The magistrate listened, the clerk took notes, and each word I spoke felt like a stone laid down after years of carrying it. When the verdict was finally given, it was not shouted. There was no applause, only the firm voice of the judge, the weight of the order pronounced, and the quiet finality of justice taking its place. I did not cheer. I did not weep. I simply breathed deeply, freely, for the first time in years. It was not loud. It was enough. When it was over, I stepped outside the courthouse into a pale, reluctant sun. The rain had eased, leaving the pavement shining, and the cold air filled my lungs like something sharp and new. For so long, I had lived as though every breath were borrowed. Now, for the first time in decades, I felt as though the air belonged to me again. That night, I went to bed without dread pressing against my chest. I pulled the quilt to my chin, listened to the quiet tick of the mantel clock, and let the darkness fold around me. Sleep came quickly, deep and steady, carrying me through the hours without interruption. When morning light spilled through the curtains, I lay still for a while, marveling at its gentleness. In the days that followed, I began to notice small mercies. My hands no longer trembled when I poured the tea. The ache beneath my ribs eased. I could eat bread again without it turning to stone in my stomach. The sound of the church bells, once a reminder of everything I had lost, rang with promise instead. One afternoon, my granddaughter flung her arms around me without warning, her laughter ringing through the cottage like music. I stood still, letting her warmth sink into my bones, and something inside me unclenched. I realized then that I was not defined by the silence I had kept, but by the courage it had taken to break it. The scars remained, of course they always would. But they no longer ruled me. They had become part of the story I carried, a map not of ruin, but of survival. And in that quiet release, I found something I had thought long gone. Peace. For the first time in years, I slept. In the months that followed, life began to stitch itself together again, slowly, unevenly, but with threads stronger than before. I no longer woke each morning with dread curling in my chest. Instead, I rose to the sound of sparrows in the hedge, the kettle whistling faithfully on the hob, and a sense, however fragile, that the day belonged to me. One Wednesday evening, I returned to the choir. I paused at the church door, heart thudding as the swell of voices reached me from within. For years, I had feared that space, the empty seat where I once sat. But when I stepped inside, someone smiled, shifted along the bench, and made room. I lifted my voice, unsteady at first, then stronger, and the hymn rose around me like an embrace. I found my way back to small acts of fellowship, to helping at the parish hall, knitting blankets for the charity circle, tending the garden with neighbors on bright mornings. Each act, however ordinary, felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had long thought lost. At home, I allowed peace to return in gentle ways. I sat on the garden bench wrapped in a shawl, watching daffodils nod in the breeze. I walked along the seafront on crisp mornings, the salt air stinging my cheeks, the weak sun glittering across the water. Sometimes I simply rested in the cottage with the fire crackling, content at last in the quiet. I was no longer the woman bowed by silence. I was someone remade, still carrying scars, but also carrying resilience, compassion, and a steadiness that only survival can teach. For the first time in decades, my life was my own. When I look back now, I see her, the woman I once was, sitting by the window with a cup of tea grown cold. The church bells tolling in the distance, her silence heavier than stone. For 50 years, that silence defined me. It shaped every day, every choice, every breath. But silence, I have learned, is not peace. It is only another prison, a wall that keeps you from your own life. Peace came only when I dared to break it, when I let the words spill out, trembling, halting, imperfect, but real. I do not pretend that speaking was easy. Even now the scars remain. They are there in the shadows of memory, in the hollow of my chest when winter nights grow long. But scars are not shame. They are the map of survival, proof that though I was broken, I was not destroyed. I once believed my voice had been taken from me. I see now that it had only been buried, waiting for the moment I was ready to let it rise again. And when it did, however softly, it carried further than I ever thought possible. There is an old saying, a cracked bell still rings true. I believe that now. The cracks in me have not silenced my song. They have made it richer, fuller, clearer. From silence to courage, that is the journey I have walked. And though it took me half a lifetime, it has led me here to a life that, while quieter, is no longer muted, to mornings where the kettle sings without dread, to evenings where the only weight on my chest is a grandchild's sleepy head, and that is how a quiet life found its voice. If you have ever carried a silence, then you know its weight. It presses into the chest, lingers in the throat, follows you into every room. For years, I thought my silence was a shield, that by keeping it, I could protect myself or protect others. But silence does not protect. It corrodes. Perhaps, As you listen, you too have known such a burden. Not the same story, perhaps, but a secret folded away like a letter never sent, hidden deep in a drawer of the heart. If so, I ask you gently, what would you do with it? Would you keep it locked inside, or would you let it out into the light? There is no single right answer. Each of us finds our own path, our own timing, our own strength. But I believe this: no voice is too small, no truth too fragile. Even the faintest whisper can be the beginning of freedom. I have told my story not for pity, but for hope, to show that even after years of silence, a voice can return, that even when broken, life can be rebuilt, that even in age, courage can come. If this story has touched you, I invite you to keep it alive. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Speak of it over tea or on a quiet walk, or in the hush of a church pew, for sometimes it is in another's voice that we find our own. And if you wish to walk further with me, I welcome you. Subscribe, listen, and join me as we weave more stories from silence into strength. Remember this: your voice may be the very spark that gives someone else the courage to speak. Your voice may be the start of someone else's courage.